So the spatial cognition components are covered. Grid cells, place cells, path integration, perception, visual perception, and so on. But that's not foraging. We need more. We need a more advanced architecture to achieve that.
So indeed, if we want to explain foraging behaving in a rat, we need a more complex structure. And this is this layer structure we have proposed in SF and we have developed during the last decade that we call distributed adaptive control. The distributed adaptive control architecture comprises 3 layers: the reactive layer, the adaptive layer, and the contextual layer. The reactive layer just assures that the system can behave. It provides a system with some basic reflexes that allows it to survive an environment. The adaptive layer is an associative learning system, and it learns the association between motor and sensory events in the environment, and thus allow the system to adapt to the contingencies of the environment. The contextual layer is a memory system that allows to store sensory motor events, then later recall it in order to reach goals and avoid obstacles in the environment. The distributed adaptive control architecture, or short just DAC, allows us to integrate the different efforts of modeling we are pursuing in the SF project. For example, in the reactive layer, the subsystems of the allostatic control, then in the adaptive layer, the sensory inputs that are then transformed to grid cells and to place cells, but then also the TPC models for classification that will then go part of the adaptive layer. Then more that we have seen then what is path integration is the interaction of the adaptive layer and the contextual layer. A key goal of the SF project is to evolve the DAC architecture towards biology. So what I show you now is how we evolve the contextual layer towards a biological plausible model of prefrontal cortex that can do rule learning and rule switching. So what is rule learning? To start, we have a robot with a camera placed in a T-maze, and in the stem of the T-maze we have a color patch, and in the crossing of the T-maze we have another color patch. So the rule the robot has to learn is that when it sees blue and then it sees red, it goes to the left. And then when it sees green and then it sees red, it goes to the right. To make the task a little bit more complicated, we switch the reward contingencies such that the robot will have to learn or relearn the rule it has learned, such that blue is now right and green is left. In biology, for solving these problems, the prefrontal cortex is critically involved. So let's have a look at prefrontal cortex and how prefrontal cortex would help us to solve this task. We incorporate 3 properties of prefrontal cortex into our rule learning system. First, in prefrontal cortex, we find neurons that have sustained activity that is related both to the sensor input as well as to the motor output. Secondly, we find a highly lateral interconnectivity between the neurons. And third, we have an innervation of the ventral tegmental area of the dopamine neurons that actually allow to modulate the activity of the neurons in relation to the reward. So let's have a look how these properties help us to solve this T-maze task. The first thing we have to learn is we have to make a relation between the green and the red, because just the red does not allow us to decide if we go left or right. So and this is done over the lateral connectivity. Whenever a neuron is activated after the other, like in this case the red is activated after the blue, the lateral connectivity between the 2 neurons will be potentiated. So in the case of the robot going through this maze with the blue one, this connectivity and this connectivity will be strengthened. Then, if the robot is placed in the other maze, this connectivity, this connection, and this connection will be strengthened. This then allows us to represent the structure of the task, because after blue always comes red, and after green comes red again. So we can distinguish this to red from this to red. The only thing we have now to say is, well, after I've received green, do I go left or do I go right? And this is exactly where the reward function is coming in, that when this one is rewarded, I will just reward this one, and this will then mean that for the blue one, I will have to reward this one, and this will allow us then to select the correct action at the red patch. So let's apply this model to the task. A typical question what you want to look at is memory capacity. How many neurons do I need to solve this task? This is what I show you here. This is the number of trials you need to have 10 consecutive correct trials. And we see that for 64 neurons, we can solve the task in a reasonable number of about 32 trials. And it's stable for more neurons. So we have also generalized the system to more complicated tasks, namely the multiple T-maze task. The rat enters the maze and has to find, after a sequence of decisions, the exit of the maze. We have shown that the model can learn the structure of the maze and can find the correct decisions for a maze that's up to 7 consecutive T-mazes. This shows that, coming from basic principles of prefrontal cortex, we can generalize a model that explains role learning and role switching, what leads us to a new contextual layer within the distributed adaptive control architecture, wherein we have integrated all the modeling efforts to explain rat foraging in a robot.
Now we have the DAC architecture, and we want to validate it against the rodent brain. You cannot do that in one step. This has to be done in a very systematic way, looking at different subcomponents. Let's focus on the issue of memory. DAC assumes that there's a short-term memory buffer that constructs representations of behavioral episodes, which are used for future reference in planning. This is the role of the hippocampus, we believe. So let's take this assumption and go back to the hippocampus in the rat brain and pose the question, what are the boundaries of these episodic representations? Does the rat only represent static space, or can I also represent dynamic space? Can I represent the properties of other agents in my environment? So for that, we're going to use the integrated experimental environment we built in the SF project, including the so-called smart object, to look at, in a very controlled way, how rats represent dynamic environments.
One of the studies that we are doing inside the Synthetic Forager project is to study how the animals track the dynamic cues, okay? How they orientate in the space. And to do that, we are using a robot, like a dynamic cue, and the animals must track the cue in order to obtain reward. The robot is waiting that the rat place it in the platform. The robot starts a movement, and only when the robot is in the right position, the rat can obtain the reward. During the subject is performing the task, we record the brain activity at the same time. The purpose of that is to know how the brain is processing the information and how it's possible to track the dynamic cue. To control both subjects is very difficult. With a robot, it's easier to use than animals. No? With animals, you must perform discrimination tasks in order to obtain a certain behavior. But with the robot, we can design every kind of movement.
So this is a rat robot setup. The rat is in the cage and has to look at the epoch when it's driving around, and it has to poke in either the left or the right hole depending on where the robot goes. If the robot goes left, then the rat has to go left. If the robot goes right, the rat has to go right to get a reward. And we want to have a look and see if there is a representation of the robot in the hippocampus of the rat. So see if he uses his place cell system to see where the robot is on the maze.
And it's a novel question because previously people have primarily looked at the hippocampus as a structure coding the rat's own position. But this question is about, can it also encode something about another agent in the environment that is relevant for the rat's own choices. For the future, we would like to focus more on the causal role of these brain structures in behavioral decision making. And then we would also like to know, how do these structures communicate with each other so that hippocampal spatial information is coordinated with prefrontal information about decision making, for instance. And we also like to know, how does sensory information reach the hippocampus through the sensory neocortex and entorhinal cortex to shape these spatial information patterns. And that should be enough for the next few years.
So the Synthetic Forager project, after 4 years since I wrote the proposal, what have we achieved? Well, a lot. The key objective of the Synthetic Forager was to build this architecture that could mimic rodent foraging in a robot, the Synthetic Forager. But not just mimic it at the behavior level, we also mimic it based on principles that we find and have validated against those found in the rat brain. So this was our objective. And we came a long way. So if we look at the architecture we developed, which was the key deliverable, the key focus of the whole system, we see that the Synthetic Forager architecture, or distributed adaptive control, has advanced a lot. We know a lot more now about the reactive regulation of behavior. We know a lot more about how episodic memories are formed in areas like the hippocampus, and we know a lot more about how behavioral rules are acquired and expressed. And this understanding has to a large extent been mapped onto the biology. So we have mapped the reactive regulation of behavior to our understanding of rat behavior, rat physiology, as in these heart rate measurements you've seen. We have mapped episodic memories to our new understanding of the hippocampus, which we also have partly covered physiologically. And on top of this, we have also learned how the rat brain actually maps space, interprets space, also in terms of its emotional relevance. On top of this, we made these advances also partially because we have delivered on this integrated experimental technology, or RBAMS, that we wanted to see realized. In that sense, on all these key points we have delivered. And this has made us very hopeful that we can now attack the next problem, which is social behavior. For that, we've written the next proposal, which will start, or the next project will start right now, which is called the Experimental Functional Android Assistant. And there we will expand this whole architecture towards notions of self and social interaction to create a humanoid robot that can engage its world socially. That's where the future is. So would I do it again in this way? Of course not. But that's also because we've learned something in the last 4 years that we did not know 4 years ago. And that's what science is all about.